Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the 2015 Earthwatch debate, Climate Change in Britain. The 2030 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals highlight the need for people from all walks of life to be actively engaged in environmental solutions, and the important role of partnerships working across sectors in helping that happen. In many ways, Earthwatch has been a pioneer in both these areas. And so I have the great pleasure of introducing our chair for this evening's debate. Tony is a campaigner, writer, sustainability advisor, and well-known British environmentalist. Thank you for being with us tonight, Tony, and without further delay, I will hand over to you to explain tonight's proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Steve. It's an absolute pleasure to be here this evening and to have the privilege of chairing this Earthwatch annual debate. This evening's discussion is going to be fascinating and illuminating, and it really is here to provoke you to be thinking about where you would put your choices in taking forward an effective programme on climate change. So it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dimitri Zenghelis. Dimitri, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Steve, and thanks to Earthwatch for inviting me here to talk today. So what I'm going to talk about in my 12 or so minutes is that I'm going to try and persuade you that we can be green and we can grow. And the reason we can be green and we can grow as a global and also as a UK economy is because of one word, and that's innovation. But innovation doesn't happen in a vacuum, and in particular the right kind of innovation that we need to be green and grow will not happen unless we steer it and direct it, and that's going to be the main essence of what I'm about to say. So if we can be green and grow, I would argue we should grow. It's not because I think people who are already materially wealthy should accumulate more material wealth. But it's difficult to talk to that half of the world that lives on around $2 a day and tell them that they don't or shouldn't have an opportunity to grow. For them, growth is a means out of poverty. It's a means back into social inclusion. And growth actually correlates with a lot of things we like, from health and education, scientific attainment, security, tolerance, equal opportunities. So innovation tends to build on innovation, and it's epitomized by the Newtonian quip that innovators see further by standing on the shoulders of giants. And that's right, but it is also a source of a problem, because if you think about that, we have locked into not just technological, but all sorts of infrastructural, network, mindset, and institutional ideas that we're going to have to shift if we're going to transform the economy towards resource and climate sustainability. We have an existing infrastructural network that is fossil fuel based. We're here gathered in London, and yet London is very much determined in shape and form by decisions made 2,000 years ago by Romans. It's also ideas. You go to Copenhagen, you go to Amsterdam, and you see that everybody cycles, and you're sort of wide-eyed, and you're prompted to ask, why does everybody cycle? And they look at you with a degree of pride, and they tell you, well, everybody cycles here because we have such fine cycling infrastructure. Okay, you respond, that's great. How did you get this fantastic cycling infrastructure? And they look at you as if you're a bit of an idiot, and they go, well, everybody here cycles. And you're left kind of puzzling, thinking, well, hang on a minute, there's clear circularity, there's a chicken and egg. That doesn't matter. The point is that once you've got the institutions and the infrastructure, the ideas tend to follow. And it's also about institutions. We have this massive fossil fuel companies. They can pay good salaries to the best graduate students to think of ever more incredibly clever ways to access fossil fuels from remote locations. They have a head start from their infrastructure. And if we're going to try and impart change, we have to be aware of the fact that the losers from any change, they know exactly who they are, they know exactly how much they're going to lose, and they know which politicians' ears to bend in order to try and prevent that change. So in a sense, you've actually got kind of, inverting Newton's quip, you've actually got giants standing on the shoulders of innovators and steering innovation in a direction that is in line with historical innovation. So how do we change that path? And the answer to that question is both simple and perplexing and taxing. We have to convincingly change expectations. Imagine you're a political leader or a business leader or a mayor, and you understand the need to go green. And you say, look, I get it, but none of my competitors are going green. It's going to cost a lot because the technologies are expensive. The finance is expensive. And frankly, there isn't even a market for this stuff anyway. You know what? I'm going to wait. Now imagine one big player moves, or two big players move, China and the US, or the EU, or there's a breakthrough in storage technology, something that shifts expectations so that people believe, for whatever reason, they suddenly believe this is going to happen. Then everything changes. You will suddenly think, whether you're a business leader, a mayor, or a politician, that if you don't move quickly, your competitors are going to steal a march on you, you're going to lose out. The dynamics change. Note, it doesn't have to be any change in the real world. All the change that happened is in there. It's psychological. Where you need a really strong, credible policy set, you need cross-party support, and you need public support. And until you get that mix, it's going to be very difficult to make the change. And in the UK, we almost had that mix with the Climate Change Act, but we are in danger of jeopardizing it. Right now, we're getting very mixed, muddled signals about the direction of climate change policy. And for investors, that means that they will demand higher returns, a higher risk premium from their investment, which makes the costs of going green higher, which of course means you're more likely to get opposition to it because it's more expensive, and which means that the policies are going to become less credible because people think they're too expensive. And very quickly, we may end up with people saying, well, look, this was all an awfully expensive mess. Let's ditch the Climate Change Act. There's some really nasty circular dynamics which we're in danger of getting trapped into. So my wrap-up slide simply says it's very difficult or impossible to predict the future, but we're actually perfectly capable of designing it, and therefore we need complementary, credible policies that shift expectations. So I just say, look, vote for whatever's going to push for change. Do it however you feel is most appropriate. You can do it through the ballot box. You can do it through, if you have your own business, change your behaviors, through exercising your consumer rights, or through protesting. They all make a difference. They're all important, but there's no silver bullet. So good luck to you. Thank you.
We're going to go straight to our next speaker in the form of Sarah Colenbrander.
Thank you, Tony. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here tonight. Before I start talking about climate-smart cities, I'd like to take a second to say thank you to Dimitri. That was great. I support everything you say, but you don't know what priority means. Everything is a priority, but sometimes a first step is required, and the debate tonight should be about what that first step is. I'm going to argue for climate-smart cities. Life in the UK is no longer rural. 82% of the British population live in urban areas. So if we were to divide up the room here tonight, all of you would live in the cities and towns of Britain, and only this tiny fraction over here would live in the country with their sheep, or pigs if they're Tories. The point is, cities are the places where most economic and social activity takes place, where most of the institutions and infrastructure that Dimitri talked about are located, and therefore cities are the ultimate cause of most greenhouse gas emissions. But the thing about climate-smart cities is that even if you don't accept the overwhelming, unequivocal body of evidence, even if you don't accept all of the scientific research that climate change is happening, we should still invest in climate-smart cities. Measures to reduce emissions from climate in cities offer huge benefits for society and the environment, above and beyond carbon savings. Climate-smart cities are cleaner, healthier, safer, quieter places to live. They're more economically productive, and they're more socially inclusive. Driving in cities is incredibly fuel inefficient. It's all that stopping and starting. As a result, although only 20% of kilometres travelled by road transport in the UK take place in cities, that 20% of trips accounts for more like 40% of road transport emissions. But our dependence on private cars, on private vehicles, is causing much more than climate change. Over 30% of air pollutants in London come from private cars and freight. Congestion costs the UK £13 billion a year. And most importantly, and devastatingly, 730,000 people are injured or killed in road collisions every year. Britain needs to invest dramatically more in public transport and cycling lanes. Buses, bikes and trains are far cheaper than private cars, both in terms of individual and in terms of total investment needs. And in addition, cities with good cycling infrastructure, Dimitri mentioned Copenhagen and Amsterdam, enjoy huge healthcare savings from increased physical activity, reduced air pollution, fewer road fatalities. Climate change is just one of many reasons that we should be investing in public transport and cycling lanes. Housing is another good example. The residential sector is responsible for 14% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions, mostly energy used for heating. Because of the poor quality of the housing stock, 1 out of every 5 households in the UK suffers from fuel poverty. They have to choose between heating and food for some months of the year. We should retrofit every one of those homes to the best possible standard, not because it will reduce our emissions, though that's important too, but because basic human decency demands that residents in a rich country like Britain shouldn't dread the winter months. We should absolutely make climate action a priority, but asthma, obesity, road accidents, pneumonia, and spiralling inequality are all priorities too. Investing in climate-smart cities will reduce our carbon footprint and make Britain a better place to live, particularly for the poorest among us. The last few years have also shown us that business and government cannot be relied upon to act independently for the global public good without oversight from civil society. The fossil fuel industry are the obvious villains, and they have driven changes in government policy in places like Canada and Australia. But now we're realising that even climate leaders like the UK government will backpedal on green policies such as subsidies for renewables. And we're realising that even green brands like Volkswagen will cheat the system with our emission test detecting software. If we're going to minimise climate change, it's clear we can't depend on the goodwill of the private or public sector. We need a vibrant, green civil society that holds government and business to account. And for 82% of UK residents, those changes need to take place in urban areas. The planet depends on people like us in cities like this choosing to live in a more sustainable way. So what can the government do? The government can make driving difficult. Cars are good for drivers, but they're not good for anyone else. The government should invest much more in cycle lanes and public transport and make sure that cars are the hardest and most expensive way to get around a city. Let's invest in energy-efficient homes. Get your windows triple glazed and your loft insulated. It's not very sexy, but it's important. If you own your own home, retrofit it. If you own somebody else's home, retrofit it. Make sure those of us who will never get on the property ladder are warm in the beds we don't own. Seriously, becoming a more sustainable and inclusive society requires us to care about the well-being of other people and other species. Dimitri's talked about transitioning to a zero-carbon society. Zero carbon? Where's your ambition? Zero poverty, zero air pollution. Climate-smart cities have a smaller carbon footprint, and that's why I'm here tonight. But climate-smart cities also have lower rates of poverty and better public health. And that's what we should be aiming for. Climate action that improves so much more than the climate.
Right, my great pleasure now to introduce Dr. Martha Crockatt.
So, right here, I hope you can all see this, I'm holding a magical system that has the potential to significantly mitigate climate change. Plants, such as these ash tree seedlings, have the capacity to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They're a key component of our natural carbon cycles and in our battle against climate change. Straight away, I started using the C word. We hear a lot of talk about carbon footprints, carbon emissions, and so on, which can make us see carbon in a purely negative light and just related to global warming. Of course, it's not just in living organisms that carbon is found. Around the planet, it's in our soils, our forests, our oceans, deep sea sediments, fossil fuels, and of course, the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. Luckily for us, about 50% of our emissions are currently absorbed by our ocean and land carbon sinks as part of this natural carbon cycle. But as our environments become increasingly degraded and as our carbon dioxide emissions continue to increase, there's no guarantee that we can continue to rely on these natural carbon sinks to such an extent in the future. There's an additional store of carbon in fossil fuels deep below the ground, the remains of once living organisms that over millions of years have become compressed into fossil fuels, primarily coal. Before humans came along, this huge store of carbon was essentially locked away and couldn't enter the atmosphere and contribute to a changing climate. However, in the last few hundred years, we've started digging it up and burning it, which releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Every year, humans are currently releasing about 10 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere, largely through burning fossil fuels, but also through deforestation, which is a key contributor to our emissions. This means that how we decide to use our land is crucial to our climate change mitigation efforts. Given the magnitude of the other stocks and fluxes that I've shown you in this diagram, it's absolutely vital not only that we protect the ecosystems that currently absorb so much of our emissions, but also that we increase our understanding of how the absorption and release of carbon are regulated. Of course, we know the basics. Plants, like this ash tree seedling, absorb carbon dioxide through photosynthesis, using that in their leaves. Some of that carbon is used for plant growth. And I'm sure everyone in this room can understand intuitively that temperature and moisture are key regulators of both this photosynthesis, this absorbing of carbon, and respiration. So that's quite simple, but when we scale it up to complex ecosystems with hundreds or even thousands of species of plants and animals in them, it's much harder to understand and predict how changes in these systems will influence carbon stocks and fluxes. In general, a healthy forest is going to absorb a bit more carbon than it releases, but extreme stress, such as an outbreak of disease or a drought, can slow down tree growth so that a forest actually releases more carbon than it absorbs. But let's not forget that forests are about far more than the carbon stored in them. They're vital to biodiversity, they provide us with food, fuel, timber and medicines, they provide us with clean air and oxygen, and of course give us amazing spaces for recreation and reconnecting with nature. We need to ensure that our terrestrial ecosystems continue to be carbon sinks rather than sources. And this is where you guys can all get involved, through citizen science. Citizen science occurs when scientists see knowledge gaps that they can't fill alone, when they enlist members of the public who often have no qualifications beyond an enthusiasm to get involved, to take an active part in data collection to address pressing research questions. And you can also go a step further and get your hands dirty by joining us on our Earthwatch project in Whiten Woods, which, as I said, investigates impacts of climate change on carbon cycling in our fragmented forests. There are also changes we should be making at a government level. In the UK, our governments have recognised the importance of forests in climate change through policies not just to protect our existing forests, but to expand them. Across the UK, about 12% of our land is forest. Before humans came along, we had about 85% forest cover, but through agriculture, road building, urbanisation, we've destroyed vast swathes of forest, leaving behind this spattering that you can see of small, isolated fragments. I'd like to see the government extend current guidelines to minimise edge effects on newly planted woodlands so that not more than 50% of our new woodland is within 100 metres of a forest edge, where we have this warmer, drier microclimate that we already know has influenced carbon cycling. Our natural carbon sinks absorb 50% of our emissions. Just imagine how hard we'd have to work to slow down climate change if we lost the carbon-absorbing powers of our natural sinks. Our forests, grasslands and oceans are not nice-to-have, greenwash, hippie extras. They're the basic framework underpinning the planet we live on, and we simply cannot afford to not to protect them in our fight against climate change. Thank you.
So, last but not least, in terms of our four presenters, I'm now delighted to introduce Dr. Mike Morecroft.
Thank you. So I'm going to be pitching to you that you should be voting for building ecological resilience, by which I'm particularly going to focus on restoring natural processes and also nurturing your ecological processes in your own backyard, your garden, your neighbourhood, your window box. We'll come on to that. Britain's biodiversity is changing. It's changing because of climate change, and it will change more in future. I can say that with confidence, not just because I've studied that kind of thing, but as a result of this report that I had the privilege to chair the production of, working with 40 or more experts in the field, and we all agreed that that was our bottom line message. Change is happening. It's happening now, and more is coming. Species are on the move. Here's one, the long-winged conehead cricket. Kind of nice, not perhaps the most cuddly in the world, but all part of our valuable, wonderful biodiversity. What you need to understand here is that when you look up here on the map, see those yellow squares there, just kind of clinging on to the bottom of southern England? That's where this creature used to be prior to 1980. The rest it's spread to in the subsequent decades. I could have put a similar graph up for literally hundreds of other species. Species are moving northwards. And across the whole range of all those different species, warming temperatures are the only sensible explanation that could explain all of them. Our natural habitats in the UK are extraordinarily fragmented. Martha's already done the warm-up act for me on that one. I don't need to dwell on that. But not only is that a problem for the integrity of woodlands, it's also a problem for species on the move, on that great march northwards. Finding a new home was never more difficult than when it's spaced out at miles apart, if you're a little conehead cricket or whatever. Sir John Lawton chaired a review a few years ago now called Making Space for Nature. And that review came to the conclusion that we needed more, bigger, better and joined wildlife sites, conservation sites. Bigger blocks of habitat are good. But we've recently got some really good evidence that actually species living in large blocks of habitats are more resilient to some of the extreme events that climate change are likely to throw at our natural environment, particularly droughts. This speckled wood butterfly and a number of other butterfly species are very sensitive to drought. Their populations are knocked back by a drought, a hot, dry summer. But we found, working with colleagues at the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, that the populations recover much better when they're in large blocks of habitat. Another example of restoration. Not so pretty? Or is it? Blanket bog. Wonderful habitat, I would say. You may not want to get up close and personal with sphagnum, but give it a go if you get the chance. Wonderful world there. Sphagnum's brilliant from all sorts of points of view. It traps water, it builds up carbon. Our biggest natural carbon stores are in the peat underneath these wetland communities in the UK. But they are more vulnerable when they've been dried and burnt and overgrazed, as many have been. This is Wallasey Island on the Essex coast, where the RSPB, working with Crossrail and a number of other partners, have created a new intertidal wetland. That's creating new habitat. It's working with the grain of nature to allow new habitat to form, to allow those natural processes to happen. And that also helps to create natural flood risk management for people as well, created in the right place. Can work. Benefits for wildlife, benefits for people, making both more resilient to a changing climate. This is London. It's a heat map of London. You can see different colours. It's hot June day in 2011. The red bits are the hot bits. They're the tarmac, they're the concrete. The cool bits, the yellow and green bits, they're the parks, the green space. Again, we can benefit nature and we can benefit people. What are you doing for nature and for working with the grain of nature in your backyard. A garden, lovely if you have it, even if you don't, in your local area. So don't tarmac your front garden to make room for your car. Sell the car, buy a bike. Sarah would agree, I know. But more important than that, it's also about making a habitat for us and for our children. And I think it's time we got on with it as a society, with all of us playing our part. If we don't engage a new generation with love of nature at that small scale, I don't believe we will ever, as a human race, progress towards sustainability. So, vote for restoring natural processes. Good for nature, good for us. Good for the economy, good for reducing emissions, good for climate-smart cities, and good for your soul. Thank you.
The idea of bigger, better, more connected natural areas is definitely something that should be and increasingly is at the heart of the climate change debate. Now your opportunity to interrogate the presenters.
I've got a question that's really for all of the panel to answer, which is that in your respective fields, what do you think are the quickest, easiest wins? In the big game of pool, what's the first shot you could take that you would advise us or the organisations we work for to do in our lives to move this process forwards, please?
Stop chopping forests down. Easier said than done, but I mean, that would be, if you could wave a magic wand and stop chopping forests down, as Tony said, about 30, we've got the potential to suck up about 30% of our carbon emissions just with forests through avoiding deforestation. And of course, avoiding deforestation as well as stopping climate change also has huge benefits for development, as we've been talking about all the other all the ecosystem services that forests deliver. So I would stop deforestation somehow.
Thank you very much. Very clear. So what's Twitter saying?
Are there benefits in alternative economic models based on well-being and happiness versus economic growth?
Our economist, our principal economist in Natural England, Tim Sunderland, a great guy, is actually one of the most eloquent speakers on other ways of valuing nature. And, you know, value, there are many different dimensions to value. Value is a useful word, but it doesn't just have to be financial. I'm sure the financial will remain important, but we have to get better at evaluating the full worth of nature. And I think our national accounts would look very different if we did.
Indeed, if one starts to subtract even the economic value of destroyed rainforest and drained blanket bog and depleted soils, and if you start to put that against GDP growth, we actually find we're not growing anymore. Yeah. Quite a powerful way into getting alternative takes on what GDP actually means.
We have just re-elected a government, one of whose planks during re-election was cut the green crap.
Yes.
So and we're stuck with them for 5 years. And probably for 10.
Okay, let me try as hard as I can to sort of be neutral and objective on this. It certainly is the case that the UK policy landscape that the government inherited was very uneven. Okay, there was so many overlapping policies, it was a little bit of a mess. So what does the government do? It comes in and it says, okay, we need a reset. Fine. So it's taken out a lot of the bits that made the policy landscape uneven, including a lot of the subsidies for renewables, and it's done something which is frankly rather weird. It's extended the climate change levy to renewables, which stops it being a climate change levy, but anyway, it's an energy levy. And we're now, waiting with bated breath to see what they're going to do to fill the hole. Because as it currently stands, there's no hope in hell of us meeting our pre-stated climate change targets as set out by the Climate Change Act and the Climate Change Committee, which led to Lord Debon, the chair of the Climate Change Committee, a former Tory, David Gummer, who you may remember eating a burger 10, 20 years ago in the context of foot and mouth disease, but probably best we don't mention that. Nevertheless, he wrote a letter to Amber Rudd, the Environment Secretary, asking her to clarify the direction of government policy. So that shows you, to some extent, the degree to which all sides of this debate that favour a clear and credible signal on climate are feeling rather desperate and bereft. That's about as positive and optimistic as I can be, except to say that, supposedly we're waiting for the positive side of this story, or the kind of, what's going to replace the stuff that's been taken away.
Thank you.
Watch the space.
So I'm looking for anybody who's not a man with their hand up. Over here, please.
How do you feel about the role that increasing urbanisation will have in getting people to think differently?
Urbanisation has the potential to be hugely good for the environment, particularly from a climate aspect. When people are living densely together, you can provide services in a much more efficient way. So things like water, energy, transport can all be provided much more efficiently with much smaller carbon footprints. It's just that, as Tony has flagged earlier, people who come to cities tend also to be richer, and so they'll consume more as well. And then cities are poorly designed, so that when you travel around cities, that it's done in very inefficient ways. So in places like Copenhagen, Oslo, Amsterdam, and actually in London, people have a much smaller carbon footprint than the national average. It's just that it could be much smaller again if we get the design right. So there is hope, but it's quite difficult to do.
So I think we're concluding from this evening that the economic agenda and being active citizens to shape that really is something we can see the sense of, but bear in mind, of course, that all of the other things actually are a part of that. So even though the argument went that way, I think we're saying that all of this is important, and I think that's a very strong message to take away from this evening. I suppose one thing I'd say as well, by way of broad reflection, is how we're just reminded tonight, as we are at every turn, how this is not an environmental issue. It is a major economic question. It's a social challenge in terms of the places we want to live, and even in relation to the demographies of our societies, bringing in questions like population. It's also a big issue in terms of how we measure the success of societies and whether this metric of growth that we have is actually the right one. So finally, can I just thank our fantastic contributors, Dimitri, Sarah, Martha and Mike, who's given us so much food for thought. Thank you all very much.